And we're live. Welcome, everybody, to Narrative Live with the fabulous Vicky Ward, who's here to talk about Epstein, to talk about Ghislaine Maxwell, to talk about Donald Trump and all their ties. It's great to see you again, Vicky. Thank you for being here again.
No, well, thank you for having me, Zev.
I keep talking about the 2003 article that you wrote about Epstein in Vanity Fair. And last time we spoke about a whole bunch of things, but the thing that you asked me was where did I think all the money was coming from Maxwell to Epstein. So that's actually formed the foundation of my latest Greatest Heist chapter, which is all about the handover between Robert Maxwell to Ghislaine and then to Jeffrey Epstein as sort of an intelligence operation, plus also all this money that has just disappeared or has landed up going to Epstein. I don't know if you got a chance to read that, but
I did. I did, and Zeb, and it was funny because it set off so many sort of alarm bells in my head that I wanted to went back and re-listened to Chasing Ghislaine, the podcast series I made that came out right before her trial on Audible, where I used a lot of the stuff that didn't make it into the 2003 Vanity Fair article, as well as more reporting. Because one of the things you wrote in your excellent piece, you remind the Promise software that was something that Robert Maxwell had been involved in. I think he owned it, or he bought it. Or
he was given a license to sell it by the Israelis. It's an American software, but this was a software that was helping prosecutors of the Department of Justice follow cases through the prosecution of criminals, but it was also a brilliant first time ever thing that allowed them to cross-reference different databases with each other. So that's why it was such an important thing. And the Israelis had an agreement with the Americans to sort of take it or steal it or whatever version of the story you want, and that's how Robert Maxwell got his hands on it.
Well, I mean, so I went back and looked at my own work, always a useful thing to do.
Yeah.
And the questions that we have about all of this, remain questions, because I think of the problems with sources, right? Because as we talked about last time, one of the main sources on sort of Jeffrey Epstein's connection to Douglas Lease and possibly the arms world. One of them, I mean, there are more than one, but a big one was Steve Hoffenberg, who is problematic because of his criminal record, right? Mm. And also now he's dead. You then have, Ari Ben Menashe, is really the main source on this idea that Jeffrey Epstein and Robert Maxwell met, right, in the 1980s, and that he was Epstein was always going to be the designated heir. Maxwell wanted to be the son-in-law, wanted him to be his son-in-law, and that, this was why there was the passing of the torch. And Ari Ben Menashe
is a challenging guy too.
Is challenging too. And yet, when I there are so many extraordinary tie-ins. I mean, one of the things that leapt out at me when I was listening this time around was, you talk about the fact that in the 1980s you had the Iran-Iraq war, you had Iran-Contra. And it leapt out at me that somebody I know very well, Christopher Mason, goes to meet Ghislaine Maxwell in 1991 in New York, and one of her dinner guests is Oliver North.
Oh wow! that's a good connection. That's amazing.
Selassie's son or someone. I mean, right. And as we talked about last time, Jeffrey Epstein at that period of his life is renting
the
Iranian government building in New York, and so it goes. And what the heck is he doing? The association with Douglas Lease, of all people, who was tied his son Julian told me his father was not tied to the El Yamama arms deal,
But he
and
was.
yet it's in the parliamentary
Yeah.
record
Mm-hmm.
that he was. And again, Douglas Leese, in all likelihood, I mean, Julian Leese, I know, will tell me I'm wrong, but many, many people I know think Douglas Leese was involved in British intelligence.
Yes.
So there are just so many concentric circles here. And I then went, again, listening to my, podcast much later on. I'm talking to David Boys, the lawyer who represented Virginia Roberts against Ghislaine Maxwell in her civil case. And he says, Ghislaine Maxwell is the person who has the answers to the questions about Epstein's money. And, he's there, and he said, the government, of course, the American government want to know the answers to this, and she's really the only person who can give it. So, I mean, it's so frustrating. But I do think that what you've done is lay out a very clear possible road map.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's obviously very interesting about it, as you talked about last time, is how, all the other key players, this is how power works, right? It is that it makes sense that everybody has tie-ins at different points.
It's interesting. Both Hoffenberg and Ben Menashe confirmed the same things to me, because Hoffenberg also told me that Ghislaine and Jeffrey had met in the 80s, and that's how. So that coincided. And he also told me that Epstein worked for the Israelis. Now, he didn't tell me it was military intelligence. He didn't give me all of that, but they coincided. Now, I don't know if they know each other. I don't think they did. I asked them at one point if they know each other. They never had connected with each other, but it's possible they did, considering the smallness of this network.
Well, and the other thing that actually in my own podcast series, this time when I'm listening, having read your, then I'm listening for so Alan Dershowitz tells me at one point that for Leslie Wexner's birthday, Jeffrey Epstein flew John Glenn, the astronaut, and Alan to Wexner's home in Ohio, where Shimon Peres was the guest of honor, educating everyone about Israeli affairs. And again, the reporting in my own podcast there was another former CIA agent called Victor Ostrowski who I talked to. There is this suggestion that the mark, if you like, was Leslie Wexner. And he's a guy I think we would all probably like to hear from.
Yeah, and I don't think we ever will. I mean, every time I've done something on Wexner, he gets very, very upset and does all strange things. So, I think he's very concerned about the reality of that story. But, the Wexner empire, just a big tangent here, based on Victoria's Secret and Abercrombie and Fitch, was also ultimately a bootlegging operation, back in the day with the Bronfmans. So, its history is really in sort of organized criminal activity underneath all that, fancy, lingerie and fabulously beautiful models. And so, and Jeffrey Epstein's...
sorry to, because you remind me of it was precisely because of that, actually, that when I had to deal with Jeffrey Epstein back in 2002, and we wondered, and he was making these threats, and we wondered, who the heck is this guy? We actually initially wondered if it was ties to the mob.
Yeah.
That might be what made him dangerous, precisely because of all of this.
I mean, I think he is tied. He is the mob. I think when you really look at Epstein and Trump as sort of two parallel paths of how the Russians were able to gain a foothold in America, they did it through organized criminal activity. And, Jeffrey Epstein was created by the Israelis, but really was created by Robert Maxwell. If you think about it that way, Robert Maxwell is a KGB spy with instructions from the head of the KGB to infect America's economy, to infect capitalism with all the stolen Soviet money. in order to collapse it, And so if that's the same instructions pouring through down, generations into Epstein and Ghislaine's work, well, then he is an organized criminal who also happens to work for intelligence, which is, of course, what the deep state sort of is. The deep state is always that
Right.
intersection between organized criminality and intelligence, which Trump was as well. Trump has this, never got in any trouble, always was an FBI informant, was always able to skirt, the law. Epstein always was able to have this espionage cover that he was able to get. They were allowed to do things with impunity while conducting
Well,
themselves,
and that's
in criminal
actually,
activity.
and I think actually I think you've written about this. I mean, I have too, and a different book in my book on Jared Kushner. I mean, the other thing when you talk about
Mm.
the FBI informant, Felix
Yeah, Felix
Sater,
Sater.
who actually we should both phone
Yeah.
now that he worked in alongside Trump, and he was absolutely huge asset for the FBI.
Yeah.
I
But
mean,
also the Kremlin. He also
yeah,
worked for Vladimir Putin. He had ties to Russian intelligence as well. So, that whole Trump Tower in Moscow thing that Felix and Michael Cohen came up with, that's how that happened. It happened through Felix Sater, and all the Russian purchases of those condos at the Trump Soho, that was also coordinated through Sater. So you've got these things keep showing up. They keep talking about the Russia hoax as being a hoax, but it's always Russia. It just always lands up being there in these storylines. And then this idea of infecting capitalism and then collapsing it, when you actually step back and you look at all these, every single company that Epstein was involved in, this financial wizard kept going bankrupt. And he kept extracting money out of them. You wouldn't know that he extracted them, but there was, $400 million or $450 million at each one of these major crashes that he did, like at Towers Financial or in the initial firing at Bear Stearns. Actually, I'd be really interested to know if you came across that, because, that
I did.
pattern of 450 million is there as well.
Well, what um, when I went back, it reminded me I need to go and look in the government archive in Kansas for the Towers bankruptcy records, because that was something Hoffenberg was pushing me to do, and they were closed during
Yes.
COVID.
Yeah.
So that is something that I have made a note to do. But I went back and I looked at what Hoffenberg had told me in detail when I first met him in jail, and then said again about how Jeffrey siphoned off the money.
Mhm.
And it was through, had a term called playing the box. And it was through, Hoffenberg gave me this example of saying to somebody, well, I'm buying a property offshore, or I'm investing in something that's worth 50 billion when in fact it's only worth 25. And that was how he would get people to put their money offshore or give him, trust him. Ironically, like Hoffenberg did. Here was the stupid thing. Jeffrey Epstein told Hoffenberg this is how he played the box. He got people to trust him, and they thought he basically took their money and kept half of it by telling them that the value was smaller than it really was.
Oh, that's good con.
And when you remember that in the last 10 years of his life, his base was the British Virgin Islands.
Yeah.
It wasn't America. That's for a reason. And but the iron, and so this is why, Hoffenberg said, as did others, that for example, he took power of fiduciary power of attorney for Leslie Wexner, because then Leslie Wexner has no comeback when Jeffrey Epstein does
Right.
whatever with his money, except after he dies to say, well, actually, he stole from me.
Yeah.
But and Hoffenberg explained to me how it never occurred to him that Epstein would do to him and to Towers Financial what he was proclaiming he was going to do or had done for everyone else. And I think I told you last time, again, I went back, like, what was he doing in the 1980s when he was hanging around with Douglas Leese, and it was that era of all those arms deals and money coming out of Russia and etc. And again, I went and looked. There is this. This is the era when he tells me that he's like a James Bond figure, and he's going to go and retrieve all this stolen money for wealthy Europeans. And the story about the Cayman Islands. So there was this very wealthy Spanish family who had money stolen from him. Epstein parachuted into the Cayman Islands, came out with a suitcase full of barrel bonds, deposited them in a Swiss bank account. But because of the foreign exchange rules at the time, the Spanish families you were only allowed to take out $10,000. So they never saw any of the fortune. Jeffrey Epstein had effectively given himself
all that money. That's interesting. The same kind of thing.
He put himself in charge of it. And I also, this time, I went back and looked carefully at what he told me, how he told me he made money. And he talked about arbitrage a lot. And it's basically, as far as I can work out, I think it's a tax evasion.
Yeah.
So, for example, he told one billionaire that they should take a loan for $1 billion in Japanese yen, buy bonds which was overvalued at the time, buy bonds with the Japanese yen, wait for the Japanese yen to depreciate, sell the bonds, and you would have made $250 million.
Yeah.
So, you start doing this at scale, and to your point, you can move markets.
Yeah. And, why were all these people investing in him? Why did he get these clients? Why did, the Leon Black become his client? And what kind of tax advice could he provide Leon Black that was worth all those hundreds of millions of dollars, or $150 million that he paid
Well,
him?
this is something I really want to look at, because there was a lot of other stuff going on at the same time that Leon Black was there was stuff that's come out in Discovery to do with the purchase of artwork that went through Jeffrey Epstein. That in itself is a huge red flag.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Wexner too, for lots of art in Wexner's world.
Anything about art. Art, like we talked about real estate last time, art is one of those completely opaque, unregulated, it's a fantastic way to launder money.
Yeah, it is.
And he talked about a member of the Rothschild family in Switzerland. All of this doesn't add up. And again, I listened in Chasing Ghislaine. He told somebody that one way to minimize tax was to put their money into overseas charities. And this person said, but that doesn't really sound legal. Epstein came back with, well, if you give me power of attorney, if anyone gets into trouble, it'll be
me.
Me.
Yeah.
So, I do think it raises huge questions about what Leon Black was paying him for. I've never thought that with Leon Black, it had anything to do with girls. No girl is worth 160.
Yeah. There was a court case where there was a Russian some
I know,
Russian
but
woman.
It was sort of went away.
Yeah.
So
the thing is about the money that I keep coming back to, because this is really the question I was trying to answer for you, was how did Epstein get so rich? Because, he died, has $600 million value. That was sort of the entire estate. It's not
that we know of.
Yeah, that we know of. But the amount of money that went in seems about $3 billion when you look at what Maxwell had off the books. Maxwell had the on the books kind of media empire, and then he had all these other operations, Promise, making him $100 million a year. He had this Iran-Contra money that he was partly a slush fund from the Israelis and the CIA. Then he took even more money from all those endeavors of selling all these arms to different countries. And then he had this commission, this 20% commission on all the money he was transferring out of Russia, out of the Soviet Union, into the West. It's a lot of money that he was amassing. And where did it go? It's not
Well,
stuff
he's
that.
very good. I mean, this was the other thing as I was re-listening.
Mm,
Tom Bower, who's a very fantastic British journalist and an old friend of mine who wrote a biography of Maxwell, says in the podcast um, that Maxwell was incredibly talented at hiding money. He'd done it all his life. So the idea that he hadn't got it stashed away in Switzerland and Liechtenstein and all over the place, of course he did. And,
just like Maxwell.
yeah, and I'm listening to my own, and I'm listening to me telling you, we've just heard how Jeffrey Epstein knows how to,
Yeah,
knows all about Swiss bank accounts.
yeah.
So, I mean, the question is how are we ever going to get to the bottom of it? Because, obviously, if a deal gets done with Ghislaine Maxwell, that's
Yeah.
terrible.
Well, I mean, it seems like a deal has been done with Ghislaine Maxwell, right? I mean, there's no way she's sitting at a minimum security prison now where she can go out for work, daily work trips, which is she can go unaccompanied to work. It's unbelievable that she can walk off that property without any fencing. Potentially she is a mastermind of this huge criminal enterprise that's been going on for decades. And, the president of the United States is just letting her, wander off into daily work activity or whatever off campus at this minimum security prison. It doesn't make any sense unless there's some sort of connection between them, and which clearly there is. So, and clearly there's a deal that's been struck. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the situation where we're wondering why this person who's a pedophile, who's got, this potentially even worse financial crime history that she committed with Jeffrey Epstein and her dad, which is an espionage operation. We were letting her stay at a minimum security prison. That's unbelievable.
It is, Sev. I mean, I mean, how this story, yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I've been deep, sort of in book stuff, so I
Yeah.
hadn't paid attention. But what is the political climate like right now for Trump about this? Have people has it eased up, or is it the same?
Yeah, I think the media's shut it down. I think there's been a 90% drop in the mentions of the Epstein case. Which means they're basically following the Trump distractions, which is, this week it's the Putin summit, another week it's whatever, DC takeover. He's just like throwing things that'll stick. And they're following that. And I think when he's dealing with foreign issues, they sort of back away. They don't like to tackle all these personal grimy stuff. But this is not going away. It's going to come back because I think on the 13th of September, some of the victims of Jeffrey and Ghislaine are going to be testifying, either in official Congress or just the Democrats are having them testify. And it could include Katie Johnson, which would be amazing if they were able to get her to appear. I mean, that's going to change the dial again back to Epstein in a way that it's going to make it very hard for the president to explain why he's got Ghislaine Maxwell in a minimum security prison. I mean, it's just, even if she says, she saw, the wording is that she saw no wrongdoing by Trump. I mean, that's a very unusual thing to say. It's not the way you'd normally say, oh, he did nothing wrong or he's not a criminal or whatever. It is that she saw no wrongdoing, whatever that might mean. And I'm sure she did see, or at least was aware of a lot of what he was doing because that was what the network was all about.
Yeah. I have a question for you.
Hmm.
So how did you get so interested in this story? Because I mean,
By
you've gone deep.
mistake. I mean, honestly,
Okay.
I was launching the narrative podcast, and I was like, well, we need something to ground it in. Let's just do a story. And we're not young and naive and stupid, didn't even know what the story was. Thought let's talk about Epstein because this was starting to bubble. And one of the first phone calls I'd made was to Stephen Hoffenberg, and I had no idea who he was, but he put out a press release one day with his number on it, and I'll just call him and see what he says. And, Stephen would always he'd give me the same answers all the time. I asked him the same questions about 1,000,000 times. He'd always give me the same factual answer to the question. He wouldn't give you anything around it. He wouldn't give you anything else, but he would give you the fact that he was able to share with you. And it was consistent all the time. And I just spoke to him so much, and I was so interested in what was motivating Trump, because that really was why I launched Narrative, was to see if we could figure out what the Trump world was, the Trump Russia world was. And I just thought there's obviously something there. There's obviously a connection between those two. And Hoffenberg convinced me that there was, and I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. And
Well,
then
you know that Jeffrey Epstein absolutely did name drop Putin. in the last 4 years of his life.
I
100%.
didn't. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. And very sadly, my source on this tragically has recently passed away. He was a great, great friend of mine, a journalist called Ed Epstein.
Oh,
And
yeah, I know
he
the
was
name.
also a great friend, actually, of Michael Wolff's. But Ed Epstein had known Jeffrey Epstein, no relation, um, for since the 1980s, and had always taken what Jeffrey Epstein said with a grain of salt, because I think Jeffrey Epstein stupidly gave him access to a computer in the 1980s. And Ed Epstein very early on was sort of able to see all the people that Jeffrey Epstein had ripped off, going back then. But he went to have tea with Epstein in New York. And because he told me all about the photographs that were recently in, I think, the New York Times, that they, the dollar bill with the wager from Bill Gates, and
Right. That's so interesting. Those.
he told
Yeah.
me all of this, but he told me that Jeffrey Epstein claimed that Vladimir Putin was a client of his.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. He was good at hiding money, and Putin had a
Right.
lot of money that he was hiding around the world. But that's a very interesting thing. That's a major story, because if we know that Epstein was surrounded by Russian operatives. There were at least 2 Russian women that were operatives. One is a confirmed SVR agent. He also had connections to a deputy minister in the Kremlin, who seemed to be sort of his handler, if there ever was one, to the Kremlin. I can't remember the guy's name.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the people that I spent a lot of time with and got to know very, very well is a Russian. She's Russian American, but she's a Russian model called Kira Diktia,
Mhm.
who was very close to Jeffrey Epstein for the last decade of his life. And interestingly, she was a Russian serious gymnast who trained
Oh,
under Alina Kabayeva,
yeah.
who is, of course, the mother of, I think, 5 of Putin's children.
Right, right. So yeah, and that's very typical of Putin. To sort of, that's the kind of people he'd farm out. There was the other one. I want to say Drukova or something like that, Dasha or something like that. I don't know if it's Dasha Drukova, who was also considered to be, she was the one who gave Putin famously this kiss at this one event when she was a sort of in the scouts there, or the Girl Scouts of Russia. But she, to give Putin a kiss would be something unusual. She also looks a lot like him. So it's not. I spoke to her at one point, and she certainly was very nervous about me reporting anything about her, about what she was doing with Epstein. And she became a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and a funder. She became kind of wealthy in a way that wouldn't be reasonable for someone of just like, who just, came off the boat and from Russia. She obviously was very connected. So, there's a lot of Russians in the Jeffrey Epstein universe. And, with Putin showing up on Friday on American soil, after this deal has been constructed with Guillain, it's all a little weird. It's just all a little. The timing is quite.
We're back to the concentric circles.
Yeah, right. It's just exactly right. It's a concentric. And what I love the fact that you didn't. Sorry, my headphones keep falling out. It's not. Do you know why? But the work you've done and the work I've done, which has been completely independent of the work that other people have done, all completely independent, keep coming back to the same things. It's not like we're finding different things. We're all finding very similar facts, um, and that to me it tells you that there is something very real going on here, and it's an intelligence operation. You know, if let's say if it's an intelligence operation, it's going to be very well obscured. I mean, they're not going to be
Yeah.
telegraphing that it's an intelligence operation. By the very nature, it's a secret.
Well, and yes, also sometimes these things, the nature of intelligence is also that it's in plain sight. So, for example, one of the other things that Jeffrey Epstein used to boast about, and remember, this is a guy who's a pathological liar.
Yeah.
But but there's bits of truth in amongst the lies, and it's a very strange thing to boast about. But he did boast about to one of my sources that he said he managed the Queen's money.
Yes.
It's obviously when the Queen was alive. Well, I mean, again, it sounds ridiculous, but connect the dots of who he was hanging out with, the Queen's favourite son at the time. He was also hanging out with Prince Andrew at a time when Prince Andrew was in charge of British trade.
Mm.
And, if you think about the access to foreign leaders around the world that Prince Andrew would have had in that capacity, it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that Epstein would have gone with him on some of these trips. And, it's not dissimilar. Reminded me of how Robert Maxwell used the Pergamon press and the Promise software to basically just move seamlessly between the leaders of the Eastern Bloc, Israel, England, and then America. And he did that in plain sight. I mean, what did he do to gain power in America? He bought the New York Daily News.
Yeah.
And that's not subtle.
No, it's not subtle at all. It's interesting. It's so interesting you mentioned the Queen because, Robert Maxwell, I found this one image of him and the Queen walking into the Commonwealth Games in 1986 was video. And he was breaking all protocol around the Queen. And I knew that they'd been friends, they're family friends for a long time. And Ghislaine actually grew up really close to Buckingham Palace. That's where she knew Andrew. And so the way he was holding the umbrella for the Queen was just not what you would do if you're following protocol. It was just, he was walking in front of her. He was doing all these things that, unless you were very familiar, you wouldn't do that. And he was doing that. So he obviously was quite close to the Queen. And so was Ghislaine, which is why the thing around Andrew is so mysterious and weird. But it's also one of the reasons they were able to, quantify this as intelligence and sort of get away with it was because Andrew put so much pressure on them to do that. I just find that whole Queen thing very, very interesting. Can I leave you one last thought, just because I know you're running out? The Towers thing. So it had Adnan Khashoggi as a principal, or at least an investor. It had Douglas Leese as a principal. It had money coming in from the Philippines, the Marcoses, right? It is cleaning Marcos's money. It potentially had the Queen's money in there, or it potentially had who's the other world leader? I'm thinking Putin's money in there, or something like that. And so this is when you look at and it had a lot of GOP people in the advisory boards, and and he kept talking about how connected he was to Hoffenberg did about all these Republicans. So you've got all these power brokers that also happen to be involved in Iran-Contra to some extent, and so and that's why I was like, well, this got to be a money washer for the Iran-Contra money, and I did never ask this on the record with Hoffenberg because I just knew the answer was going to be too much for him to confirm. But I did when I met him in person at one time. I pulled him aside and I said, all of this just doesn't make sense unless it belongs to Iran-Contra. And he confirmed that it was, but he didn't even realize it until much later that was what Iran-Contra, that the money would have been washed through, not necessarily Iran-Contra, but the proceeds of all these weapons deals that Douglas Leese was involved in.
Yeah. So I've always had the impression, and by the way, I asked Khashoggi's daughter about this as well, and I think, if memory serves, she remembered Douglas Leese, and I think Maxwell. Yes, I don't know if she knew about the Epstein connection, but I will tell you, Zev, that based on my reporting, and obviously I never met Douglas Leese, but I know a lot of people who did know him. I have to believe that he would have been the mastermind. He and Khashoggi, because who he was very close to, because everything that I would have to believe that Hoffenberg would have been a more patsy figure in that he would have been a useful, ambitious guy who was willing to cut corners. We know that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hoffenberg told me that Leese was the guy who created the handover, who masterminded the handover between Maxwell and Sorry.
Yeah.
And Epstein, that was his creation. He figured it out. And, this is what he did. I mean, Douglas Leese was involved in a few scandals involving weapons trading around the world. Julian Leese was involved in one of them too in the Far East. So, that he was a sort of senior operator who's able to handle the Al Yamana deals. It was obviously putting very close to the British government and the
Well,
and
and
the and the
I'll
Queen.
just give you
Yeah.
2 little anecdotes on this. So I do have a British friend who was sent round to Douglas Leese by his father to he needed a passport in a hurry and no questions asked. And Douglas Leese was able to do that. But when I have the transcripts of all my conversations with Jeffrey Epstein. So I asked him about Douglas Leese. And he got sudden amnesia. Douglas who?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, maybe, that was somebody possibly related to a Nick Ferranti. I mean, he got, that he did not want to pursue that line of conversation.
The same thing happened with Ari Ben Menashe when I asked him about Douglas Leese. He was like, no, I don't know who that person is. And I was like, how could you not know who that person is? So, but this was an era that they were trying to cover up. This whole period in the 80s, they were trying to keep that secret because that's the planning stage for this takeover, this handover from Maxwell to Epstein. And, it's so great to have your input on all these things because you've got so many corresponding facts and supporting evidence that it's really it's fantastic to be able to share this with you and hear from you about all your details. We should probably find a way to incorporate them into some of the stories because it's too. Yeah, there's so much. It just helps so much, and it fills a lot of the blanks.
Do the Venn diagrams or something, like map it out.
Yeah. I'd really love to do that.
Yeah.
So
all right.
we'll keep chatting.
We can talk offline.
Yeah.
And do that, and we have a record of this conversation, which is good.
Yes, which is great. Which is why the same thing with Hoffenberg. I did all these things live, and I'm so glad I did because that's where the record was. I would never have probably recorded all these things or kept them in the way that we have. Vicky, you've got 2 amazing books out. Do you want to tell people about the books that you're currently doing, and then?
Well, this one, the Idaho 4.
Yeah,
it's sat at the New York Times number 1 slot.
Yeah, fantastic! Congrats.
So very proud of that. We just announced. So James Patterson and I are going again. We just announced we're writing a book about the murder of the United Health CEO.
Oh, wow.
And Luigi Mandoni. So that's going to keep me out of trouble for the next year.
That is a good one. That is going to be an amazing story. Wow.
Yeah. But I also do encourage everyone on this topic, because actually, you prompted me, Zev, so thank you for this, to listen to Chasing Ghislaine.
Right.
Because it does go deep into everything we've talking about. Who was Robert Maxwell? What were the intelligence ties? And what does it seem sort of strangely coincidental that Jeffrey Epstein was also involved in? And it's a deep dive on a lot of the stuff that we've just been talking about.
I've heard it before. I listened to the series, but I haven't listened to it recently. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to listen
it was
to
really helpful because I was like, And then, when the detail about her producing Oliver North.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
At dinner, I was like,
when was that? Was that well after
1991.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that she had just arrived in the States and she's like already connected to Oliver North. Wow. That is amazing. Vicky Ward, thank you very much for doing this again. Love talking to you. It's really fun. And we'll do it again.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.